On the morning of August 18, 1980, auditors at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio discovered that $3.2 million in negotiable bearer bonds had vanished from a secure storage facility. The theft represented one of the largest unsolved military installation robberies in American history. For 27 years, federal investigators pursued dead ends and false leads, never imagining that the person responsible had been right under their noses the entire time. The bonds, untraceable instruments as good as cash, had simply evaporated into thin air, along with any evidence of who had taken them. The case went cold by 1985, filed away in FBI archives as an embarrassment to military security protocols. It wasn't until 2007, when a real estate agent walked through a modest ranch house in suburban Kettering, Ohio, that the truth would finally emerge from behind a false wall in an unfinished basement. The man responsible had lived quietly for nearly 3 decades, just 15 miles from the scene of his perfect crime, and his name was Terrence Deshaun Williams. What made Williams's theft so remarkable wasn't just the amount he stole or how long he evaded detection. It was the fact that he accomplished it all while working as a night shift janitor, a position so invisible that investigators initially overlooked him entirely. He had turned his obscurity into his greatest asset, understanding that the most effective disguise wasn't a mask or an alias, but simply being the kind of person nobody bothers to remember. For years after the theft, Williams continued his life in Dayton, working ordinary jobs, paying his taxes, and maintaining the appearance of someone living paycheck to paycheck. He never fled to another country, never changed his identity, never drew attention to himself with extravagant purchases. He simply waited, patient and disciplined, knowing that time was the final element of his plan. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Terrence Williams grew up in the Westwood neighborhood of Dayton, the youngest of 4 children, raised by a single mother who worked double shifts at Good Samaritan Hospital. By all accounts, he was an intelligent but unremarkable student at Dunbar High School, graduating in 1968 with grades good enough for college, but no money to attend. Instead, he enlisted in the Air Force, serving 4 years as a supply clerk at bases in Texas and California. His service record was clean, if undistinguished. He received an honorable discharge in 1972 and returned to Dayton, where he drifted through a series of warehouse and maintenance jobs. By 1976, Williams had settled into work as a custodial employee for Midwest Services Corporation, a civilian contractor that provided janitorial and maintenance services to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. The base, sprawling across nearly 8,000 acres in Greene and Montgomery counties, served as a major logistics and research hub for the Air Force. It employed over 22,000 people and housed everything from aircraft testing, facilities to administrative offices managing procurement and finance operations. For a company like Midwest Services, the contract was lucrative and stable. For employees like Williams, it meant steady work at $4.85 an hour, full benefits, and the kind of security clearance that made them feel important, even if their actual duties were mundane. Williams worked the overnight shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 5 nights a week. His assignment included Building 262, a nondescript 3-story structure in the base's administrative complex. The building housed various finance and procurement offices, including a secure storage facility on the ground floor where negotiable instruments, bearer bonds, and other financial documents were kept before processing. These bonds, relics of a pre-digital era, were essentially paper cash in large denominations. They belonged to no one specifically until redeemed, which made them both valuable and dangerous to keep in large quantities. Security at Building 262 followed standard military protocols for the late 1970s, which meant it was thorough but not sophisticated by later standards. The storage facility required 2 keys for entry, one held by the day shift finance supervisor and another by the base security office. An alarm system connected to the base police station monitored the doors. Inside, bonds and other instruments were kept in locked filing cabinets, with access logs tracking every entry and removal. The system depended on multiple layers of bureaucracy and accountability, operating on the assumption that no single person could circumvent all the safeguards. What the system didn't account for was someone with time, access, and patience. Williams had all 3. His first advantage was invisibility. Janitorial staff moved through secure buildings with a kind of administrative immunity. They had keys and access codes by necessity, but they were so thoroughly dismissed as insignificant that their presence barely registered. Williams cleaned offices while officers worked late. He emptied trash cans in conference rooms where classified budgets were discussed. He mopped floors in hallways where secure doors stood open for convenience. Over months, and then years, he observed everything with the quiet attention of someone who had learned early in life that powerful people rarely notice the help. Williams noticed patterns. He learned that the finance supervisor, a Captain Gerald Morrison, often left his key ring on his desk when he went to the bathroom down the hall. He observed that the security office kept the second storage facility key on a pegboard with 24 others, distinguished only by a small tag with a room number. He noted that the alarm system for Building 262 was part of an older network that could be temporarily disabled from the building's main electrical panel during maintenance work. He discovered that the access logs for the storage facility were collected monthly, but often sat in an inbox for weeks before anyone reviewed them. Most importantly, he recognized that the bearer bonds were processed in irregular batches. Sometimes the storage facility held relatively little. Other times, usually when large contracts were being finalized or payments processed for major acquisitions, the facility might hold millions of dollars worth of negotiable instruments awaiting distribution or deposit. The bonds would arrive from the Treasury Department in sealed containers, be signed for and logged by Captain Morrison, and then sit in the facility for anywhere from 3 days to 2 weeks before being transported to banks or distributed to contractors. Williams began his planning in early 1978, more than 2 years before the actual theft. His approach was methodical and patient, built on the understanding that rushing would only create mistakes. He started by making impressions of Captain Morrison's keys one at a time over several months, using a bar of soap he kept in his cleaning cart and taking the impressions during the brief windows when Morrison left his office. He took the soap impressions to a locksmith in Cincinnati, a 45-minute drive from Dayton, and had copies made using a false name and a story about replacing lost house keys. The security office key proved more challenging. Williams couldn't simply borrow it without drawing attention. Instead, he spent 3 months observing the security office during shift changes, noting when the office was staffed by a single airman who often stepped outside to smoke. On a cold February night in 1979, Williams entered the office during one of these smoke breaks, photographed the key against a ruler to capture its exact size and teeth pattern, and left within 90 seconds. He had the key duplicated at a different locksmith in Columbus, again using false pretenses. With access secured, Williams turned his attention to the alarm system. He studied the electrical panels during his normal maintenance duties, taking note of which circuits controlled security systems. He learned that Building 262's alarms could be bypassed by removing a specific fuse during the brief window between the system's regular test cycle at 2 a.m. and the automated reset at 2:15. If someone knew exactly which fuse to pull and could restore it within 15 minutes, the system would reset normally, and the security log would show nothing more than a routine test cycle. Williams tested his theory on 3 separate occasions over 6 months, each time pulling the fuse and monitoring whether anyone responded. No one ever did. The base police assumed any irregularity during the test cycle was normal system behavior. Williams had found his window. The final element of his plan involved understanding the bond shipments themselves. He began paying attention to delivery schedules, noting that large shipments typically arrived on Wednesdays or Thursdays and were processed by Friday afternoon. By casual conversation with other maintenance workers and careful observation of increased activity in the finance offices, Williams learned to predict when valuable shipments were in the storage facility. He needed a significant amount to make the risk worthwhile, but not so much that the theft would trigger an immediate nationwide manhunt. He decided his target was between $2 and $4 million, a sum large enough to disappear with, but potentially small enough to be seen as an internal accounting error, at least initially. Williams spent months considering how he would transport and hide the bonds. He purchased a large military surplus duffel bag from an Army-Navy store in Cincinnati. He bought a second-hand pickup truck, registered under his brother's name, parking it in different locations around the base perimeter. He scouted routes from Building 262 to the perimeter fence, timing how long it took to walk them at night. He identified a section of fencing near the southern edge of the base, where tree cover blocked the view from the nearest security checkpoint. By summer 1980, Williams had everything in place except the final element: nerve. He had the means and the plan, but he still needed to commit to the reality of what he was about to do. He was 30 years old, making barely $12,000 a year, living in a cramped apartment in East Dayton with a girlfriend who was growing tired of his inability to provide anything beyond survival. His mother's health was failing, and her medical bills exceeded what Medicare would cover. His older brother Jerome had fallen behind on child support and was asking for loans Williams couldn't afford to give. The pressure of working poverty grinds differently than acute crisis. It's the exhaustion of never having enough, of watching opportunities pass by, of knowing that a single unexpected expense could collapse everything. Williams wasn't desperate in the dramatic sense. He wasn't about to lose his home or facing criminal charges. He was simply tired of being invisible in every way that mattered, and he had spent 2 years preparing a way out. On August 15, 1980, Williams confirmed through overheard conversations that a major bond shipment had arrived that Wednesday. Captain Morrison had processed the delivery Thursday afternoon, and the bonds were scheduled for transport to Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland the following Monday. Williams had 3 nights, but he chose Friday, August 15th. Weekend staffing at the base was lighter, and any anomalies wouldn't be noticed until Monday morning at the earliest. He arrived for his shift at 11 p.m., carrying his usual cleaning supplies and the large duffel bag folded at the bottom of his cart, hidden under trash liners and rags. His heart hammered as he swiped his ID card at the Building 262 entrance, but his hands remained steady. The security guard, an airman named Johnson, whom Williams had greeted 5 nights a week for 4 years, barely glanced up from his magazine. Williams began his normal cleaning routine on the 3rd floor, working his way down. He needed to wait until after the 2 a.m. alarm test cycle, and he needed the building to be as empty as possible. By 1:30, the last officer working late had finally left. Williams was alone with his mop bucket and his carefully constructed plan. At 1:55, he made his way to the electrical room in the basement. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the panel and located the specific fuse he had identified months earlier. At exactly 2:03, during the test cycle, he pulled the fuse and slipped it into his pocket. The building's alarm system went silent, though Williams knew from his test that the security monitoring station would register nothing unusual during the test window. He moved quickly to the storage facility on the ground floor. His copied keys worked smoothly in both locks. The door opened, and Williams stepped into a room lined with filing cabinets and several reinforced storage lockers. He had exactly 12 minutes before he needed to restore the fuse. The bearer bonds were in a locked cabinet marked with that week's date. Williams used a small pry bar to force the lock, knowing that the damage would be discovered regardless of how careful he was. Inside were 3 sealed containers, each labeled with Treasury Department codes and warning labels about federal prosecution. Williams didn't open them. He simply transferred all 3 containers into his duffel bag, zipped it closed, and left the storage facility. He relocked the doors behind him, pocketed his duplicate keys, and returned to the electrical room. At 2:14, he restored the fuse. The alarm system reset as it always did, and the security log recorded nothing but a successful test cycle. Williams hoisted the duffel bag, now weighing close to 30 pounds, onto his cleaning cart and covered it with his usual supplies. The next 40 minutes were the longest of his life. He resumed cleaning the 2nd floor, forcing himself to maintain his normal routine, even as adrenaline screamed at him to run. He knew that any deviation from his usual pattern would be remembered if investigated later. He mopped floors, emptied trash cans, and wiped down bathrooms, all while the duffel bag sat in his cart. At 3:45, Williams took his usual break. He wheeled his cart outside for a smoke, something he did most nights. The guard at the entrance nodded at him. Williams walked to the smoking area near the building's south side, then continued past it into the shadows. He abandoned his cleaning cart, hoisted the duffel bag onto his shoulder, and walked quickly toward the tree line at the base perimeter. The fence was 8 feet of chain link topped with barbed wire, but Williams had identified a spot where the bottom had rusted loose from the posts. He pushed the duffel bag underneath, then squeezed through himself, tearing his jacket on the wire. On the other side, he picked up the bag and walked through the trees to where his truck was parked on a rural access road. He threw the bag in the truck bed, covered it with a tarp, and drove away. He didn't go home. Williams drove to a storage unit he had rented 3 months earlier in Springfield, a town 30 miles west of Dayton. He had paid for a year in advance, using cash and a false name. Inside the unit, he opened the containers and confirmed what he had stolen. Negotiable bearer bonds with a total face value of $3.2 million. Williams sat in the empty storage unit at dawn, surrounded by more money than he had imagined existed in one place, and felt not triumph, but a strange calm. The hard part, he knew, was just beginning. He returned to his apartment in Dayton at 7:30 that morning, the same time he usually arrived after his shift. His girlfriend was already at work. Williams showered, changed clothes, and burned the ones he had worn, including the torn jacket. He went to bed and slept for 4 hours, then woke and called in sick for his weekend shifts, claiming a stomach flu. This was plausible. He had rarely called in sick before, and weekend maintenance was often understaffed anyway. Monday morning brought the discovery. Captain Morrison opened the storage facility for a routine inventory check before the scheduled transport and found the forced cabinet and missing containers. Within an hour, Air Force Office of Special Investigations agents were swarming Building 262. By afternoon, FBI special agents from the Dayton field office had joined the investigation. The initial assumption was an inside job by someone with financial access. Investigators focused on Captain Morrison and other officers who handled the bonds, conducting interrogations and reviewing financial records. The possibility that a janitor had executed the theft seemed too implausible to consider seriously at first. When investigators did begin interviewing custodial staff, Williams wasn't immediately suspected. He had called in sick that weekend, which actually provided a kind of alibi. His background check was clean, his financial situation showed no sudden changes, and he had no criminal record. Special Agent Robert Kowalski led the FBI investigation. He was a 15-year veteran known for his methodical approach and unwillingness to accept easy answers. Kowalski interviewed every person who had access to Building 262 that weekend, reviewed security logs, and analyzed the alarm system records. He found the test cycle irregularity, but concluded it was likely a coincidence. The system logged successful resets, and the security contractor insisted the equipment had functioned properly. Williams returned to work the following week, maintaining his normal routine despite the heightened security and investigator presence. He was interviewed briefly by an Air Force investigator, who asked routine questions about whether he had noticed anything unusual that Friday night. Williams said he hadn't, which was technically true. He had been too focused on his own actions to notice much else. The investigation expanded rapidly. The FBI traced the bond serial numbers and issued alerts to banks nationwide. They interviewed known fences and black market dealers who might attempt to cash the bonds. They reviewed financial records of everyone connected to the base. They considered whether the theft might be connected to organized crime or foreign intelligence services. Months passed with no viable leads. By January 1981, Special Agent Kowalski had developed a theory that the thief was someone with regular, unnoticed access to Building 262, possibly custodial or maintenance staff. He began deeper background checks on all contract employees, including Williams. The investigation revealed nothing suspicious. Williams had no significant debt, no criminal associates, no unexplained income. He lived modestly, worked steadily, and kept to himself. What investigators didn't know was that Williams hadn't touched the bonds. They sat in the Springfield storage unit, untouched except for a single visit each month when Williams paid the rental fee in cash. He had decided to wait at least 5 years before attempting to cash any bonds, understanding that the intense investigation would eventually cool but never completely end. His strategy was patience. Williams made one significant change to his life. He ended his relationship with his girlfriend and moved to a small house in Kettering that he rented from an elderly widow. He told people he wanted more space and quiet. In reality, he needed to distance himself from anyone who might notice changes in his behavior or circumstances. He continued working his janitorial job, continued living on his modest salary, and gave no one any reason to remember him as anything other than another invisible worker passing through their peripheral vision. The FBI investigation gradually wound down through 1982 and 1983. Special Agent Kowalski remained convinced the thief was connected to the base, but without evidence, the case grew cold. By 1985, the investigation was officially inactive, though the bond serial numbers remained flagged in banking systems nationwide. The Air Force overhauled security procedures for handling negotiable instruments, installing better alarm systems and requiring more frequent audits. Building 262 became a cautionary tale in military security training. Williams waited 7 years before touching the bonds. In 1987, he finally began the careful process of converting them to usable money. He couldn't simply walk into a bank and deposit millions in bearer bonds that would trigger immediate investigation. Instead, he traveled to major cities across the Midwest and cashed individual bonds at different banks, never more than $50,000 at any one location, spacing transactions months apart. He developed a cover story. He was settling his deceased father's estate, and the bonds had been found in a safety deposit box. He carried forged documents supporting this narrative, including a fake death certificate and estate papers he had purchased from a document forger in Detroit. The story was plausible enough that bank tellers, especially in the pre-computer era of limited information sharing, accepted it without excessive scrutiny. The process took 4 years. Williams traveled constantly on his days off, taking buses to Cleveland, Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Louisville, and Pittsburgh. He never flew, knowing airlines kept better records. He never used the same bank twice. He deposited the money into multiple accounts he opened using his real name, spreading the funds across different institutions and keeping individual balances below $50,000 to avoid reporting requirements. By 1991, Williams had successfully laundered nearly $2.8 million of the original $3.2 million. The remaining bonds he destroyed, burning them in a barrel behind his rented house and scattering the ashes. He had accepted that converting everything was too risky. What he had was more than enough. Williams quit his janitorial job in 1992, citing health issues. He was 42 years old and had worked overnight shifts for 16 years. He told acquaintances he had received a small inheritance from a distant relative and planned to live simply on those savings. No one questioned this. Williams had always been so private and unremarkable that even his departure from the workforce barely registered with former co-workers. He continued living in Kettering, eventually purchasing the small house he had been renting when the widow who owned it passed away in 1994. He paid cash, telling the widow's children he had saved carefully over the years. The house was modest, a 3-bedroom ranch built in 1965 with an unfinished basement and a small backyard. Nothing about it suggested wealth. Williams's life for the next 15 years followed a careful pattern. He lived frugally but comfortably. He drove older but reliable cars purchased with cash. He traveled occasionally, always domestically and never extravagantly. He volunteered at a community center, attended church sporadically, and maintained friendly but distant relationships with neighbors. He dated occasionally, but never seriously, having decided that marriage and family would create complications and questions he couldn't afford. His one indulgence was his basement. Williams had always been interested in woodworking, a hobby he developed during his years of waiting. In the unfinished basement, he built an elaborate workshop with custom storage and workbenches. Part of that construction included a false wall behind his main workbench, accessed through a panel that appeared to be part of the wall's stud framework. Behind that false wall, in the space between the basement and the house's foundation, Williams had built a hidden room approximately 6 feet wide, 8 feet long, and 7 feet high. This secret room contained the physical evidence of his crime and the remaining proceeds of his theft. Metal filing cabinets held meticulously organized records, maps of Wright-Patterson, copies of his own planning documents, photographs of Building 262, records of every bond he had cashed and where. He had kept everything, partly as insurance and partly as proof to himself that the greatest achievement of his life had really happened. The room also contained over $400,000 in cash that Williams had never deposited, keeping it as an emergency reserve. He had installed a dehumidifier to prevent moisture damage and ventilation to prevent musty odors that might reveal the space's existence. Williams visited his hidden room infrequently, usually just to add money or update his records. The room represented both his triumph and his prison. He had successfully committed and escaped the consequences of a major crime, but he could never share that success with anyone. The money had bought him freedom from work and financial worry, but not from isolation or the low-level anxiety that any unexpected event might unravel everything. There were close calls over the years. In 1998, Williams was involved in a minor car accident. When police arrived to file the report, He experienced a moment of panic that they might somehow connect him to the cold case. They didn't. They simply filed an accident report and sent him home. In 2003, the IRS audited his tax returns, questioning how he supported himself without employment. Williams provided documentation of his inheritance and investment income from his various bank accounts. The auditor accepted his explanation and closed the case. The psychological toll of maintaining his secret for decades manifested in subtle ways. Williams developed insomnia, often lying awake at night, replaying the theft or imagining scenarios where he was discovered. He avoided close friendships, always keeping people at arm's length. He never confided in anyone, never hinted at his past, never allowed himself the relief of confession. The isolation wore on him, creating a kind of emotional flatness that neighbors sometimes commented on. Williams was pleasant but empty, present but absent, alive but not quite living. By 2006, Williams was 56 years old and beginning to consider his mortality. He had no children, no close family, and no one to leave his carefully hidden wealth to. His mother had passed away in 1994, never knowing what her son had done. His siblings had scattered across the country, and he maintained only occasional contact with them. Williams began to realize that his perfect crime might ultimately mean nothing. When he died, likely alone in his modest house, the hidden room would eventually be discovered. The truth would emerge, but he wouldn't be alive to face consequences or receive any acknowledgement of his accomplishment. This realization led him to make a decision that would ultimately undo everything. In early 2007, Williams was diagnosed with high blood pressure and early signs of heart disease. His doctor recommended lifestyle changes and medication, but Williams understood he was facing the beginning of the end. He decided he would not die with his secret, but neither would he confess directly. Instead, he would leave behind a complete record of what he had done, trusting that someday, long after he was gone, someone would find it and understand. He spent months in 2007 organizing the hidden room's contents, creating a coherent narrative of the theft through his documents and notes. He wrote a detailed confession, explaining his motivations, methods, and the years of hiding. He placed this confession in a sealed envelope with instructions to be opened by whoever discovered the room. Then he simply continued his life, waiting for whatever would come next. What came next was completely unexpected. In September 2007, Williams's doctor recommended more aggressive treatment for his heart condition, suggesting he might need eventual surgery. Facing mounting medical expenses and unwilling to draw down his legitimate bank accounts in ways that might trigger questions, Williams made a fatal mistake. He decided to sell his house, take the proceeds, and move to a smaller apartment where he could live more cheaply and access the hidden room's cash without suspicion. He listed the house with a local real estate agency in October 2007. The asking price was $145,000, appropriate for the neighborhood and housing market. The agent, a woman named Patricia Hensley, conducted her initial walkthrough and noted the house's generally good condition, but recommended addressing the unfinished basement before showings. She suggested Williams at least clean up the workshop area and remove the clutter to make the space appear larger. Williams agreed, understanding he needed to dismantle his workshop carefully and relocate everything from the hidden room. He planned to do this over several weeks, moving cash and documents to a new storage unit. But before he could begin, Patricia mentioned the house to a contractor she knew, suggesting Williams might get a better price if he finished the basement. The contractor, James Sullivan, offered to do a free assessment. Sullivan visited the house on November 3, 2007. He measured the basement, checked for moisture issues, and examined the structure. As he inspected the walls behind Williams's workbench, Sullivan noticed something unusual. The wall's proportions seemed off. The distance from the main basement space to where he estimated the foundation should be didn't match the house's exterior dimensions. He mentioned this to Williams, suggesting there might be a structural issue or settlement problem. Williams felt ice in his stomach, but maintained his composure. He thanked Sullivan and said he would think about the basement work. After Sullivan left, Williams knew he had to act quickly. He started dismantling the false wall that night, planning to remove everything from the hidden room and abandon the house sale, inventing some excuse about changing his mind. But Sullivan, who had decades of experience with old houses, couldn't shake his curiosity about the dimensional mismatch. On November 5th, he mentioned it to a friend who worked for the Kettering building department, casually noting that he had found a house with what might be an unreported addition or structural modification. In older homes, such modifications sometimes violated building codes or created safety hazards. The building inspector, following routine procedure, decided to schedule an inspection. On November 12, 2007, Building Inspector David Chen arrived at Williams's house unannounced, citing concerns about possible code violations that might affect a sale. Williams had no choice but to allow the inspection. Chen examined the basement carefully, and like Sullivan, noticed the dimensional discrepancy. He asked Williams if there had been any structural modifications. Williams said he wasn't aware of any, claiming he had purchased the house as is. Chen, a thorough inspector with 30 years of experience, began tapping on walls, listening for hollow spaces. When he reached the wall behind the workbench, the sound changed. He asked Williams to move the workbench. Williams complied slowly, his mind racing through options. Chen examined the wall more closely and found the hidden panel. He opened it. Behind the panel was a narrow doorway leading into darkness. Chen used his flashlight and saw the hidden room, the filing cabinets, the stacks of cash. He turned to Williams, who stood frozen, knowing his carefully constructed life was collapsing. Chen immediately called the Kettering Police Department. Officers arrived within minutes. Williams did not resist or try to flee. He sat quietly in his living room as police explored the hidden room, photographing everything and beginning to document what they had found. The cash alone was clearly suspicious, but the filing cabinets contained something more significant: a complete confession and detailed records of the 1980 Wright-Patterson Air Force Base theft. Detective Sarah Morrison, no relation to the Captain Morrison from the original case, read Williams's confession and immediately recognized the connection to one of the area's most notorious unsolved crimes. She contacted the FBI field office in Dayton. By evening, federal agents were at Williams's house, processing the scene and taking him into custody. Special Agent Michael Rodriguez, who had inherited the cold case files when he joined the Dayton FBI office in 2005, couldn't believe what he was reading. The case that had stumped investigators for 27 years had just solved itself through a house inspection triggered by a home sale. Williams's meticulous records provided everything prosecutors would need: dates, methods, locations where he had cashed bonds, even photographs he had taken during his planning phase in 1978 and 1979. Williams was charged with theft of government property, a federal offense with no statute of limitations. He was also charged with money laundering and fraud related to the false documents he had used to cash the bonds. At his arraignment, Williams pleaded guilty to all charges, offering no defense. His attorney argued that Williams had lived a law-abiding life for 27 years since the crime and posed no danger to society, but prosecutors emphasized the sophisticated nature of the theft and the breach of military security. In March 2008, 68-year-old Terrence Williams was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. The judge noted the unusual nature of the case, acknowledging that Williams had indeed lived quietly for nearly 3 decades, but emphasizing that the crime itself was too serious to excuse. The $400,000 in cash found in the hidden room was seized, along with Williams's other assets, though the government recovered less than 15% of the original theft amount. The rest had been spent, or was hidden in accounts Williams refused to disclose. Williams served 7 years of his sentence at Federal Correctional Institution, Elkton in Ohio, before being released in 2015 due to failing health. He died in a nursing facility in Columbus in 2017, having given only one interview during his incarceration. In that interview, Williams expressed no remorse for the theft itself, but acknowledged regret about the isolation his secret had imposed. He said the money had bought him freedom from poverty, but had cost him the possibility of genuine human connection. He had lived his entire adult life as two people: the invisible janitor everyone forgot, and the brilliant thief no one could acknowledge. The case prompted renewed scrutiny of security procedures at military installations and accelerated the military's transition away from bearer bonds toward electronic financial instruments. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base used the case in security training for years afterward, emphasizing that the greatest vulnerabilities often come from overlooked personnel with extended access and patient observation. For the real estate agent Patricia Hensley and contractor James Sullivan, the discovery became a story they would tell for the rest of their lives, a reminder that the most ordinary circumstances can conceal extraordinary secrets. For Building Inspector David Chen, It represented the strangest finding of his career, proof that sometimes doing a thorough job uncovers more than code violations. The hidden room in Williams's basement was eventually dismantled when the house sold in 2009. The new owners, aware of the house's history, gutted the basement and refinished it completely, wanting no trace of what had been hidden there. The house is now indistinguishable from its neighbours. Another modest ranch in a quiet Kettering neighbourhood, its secret history, known only to those who remember the news coverage. Terence Williams's story remains a cautionary tale about both the possibilities and the costs of perfect crimes. He proved that with patience, observation, and discipline, it is possible to commit a major theft and evade detection for decades. But his story also demonstrates that the isolation required to maintain such a secret can be its own prison, and that the longest-term plans can be undone by the most mundane circumstances: a house sale, a contractor's curiosity, a routine building inspection. These ordinary events revealed what 27 years of FBI investigation could not. In the end, Williams succeeded at his crime but failed at its purpose. The money never bought him the life he imagined because the secret prevented him from truly living. He died having spent more years in hiding than he had lived freely before the theft. A man who had made himself invisible so successfully that he disappeared even from his own life. His perfect crime became his perfect trap, and the truth emerged not through brilliant investigation, but through the simple mechanics of selling a house and the professional diligence of a building inspector, who noticed that a wall was in the wrong place. The aftermath of Williams' arrest rippled through communities that had unknowingly harboured him for decades. Neighbours in Kettering expressed shock and disbelief when news crews descended on the quiet street in November 2007. Margaret Chen, who had lived 3 houses down from Williams for 12 years, told reporters she had always found him pleasant but distant. She remembered him helping her carry groceries once during a snowstorm in 2003, never speaking much but always offering a polite nod when they passed on the sidewalk. The idea that this quiet, unremarkable man had been living on millions in stolen money seemed impossible to reconcile with the person she thought she knew. The case also reopened wounds for those connected to the original investigation. Special Agent Robert Kowalski, who had led the FBI's inquiry in 1980 and 1981, was retired and living in Florida when he learned of Williams' arrest. In a telephone interview with the Dayton Daily News, Kowalski admitted feeling both vindicated and frustrated. He had been correct that the thief was someone with routine access to Building 262, but the investigation had never pushed hard enough on the civilian contractor employees. The assumption had been that a janitor lacked the sophistication to plan and execute such a theft. That assumption, Kowalski acknowledged, had been their fundamental error. Williams hadn't been sophisticated despite being a janitor. He had been successful because he was one. The aftermath of Williams's arrest rippled through communities that had unknowingly harboured him for decades. Neighbours in Kettering expressed shock and disbelief when news crews descended on the quiet street in November 2007. Margaret Chen, who had lived 3 houses down from Williams for 12 years, told reporters she had always found him pleasant but distant. She remembered him helping her carry groceries once during a snowstorm in 2003, never speaking much but always offering a polite nod when they passed on the sidewalk. The idea that this quiet, unremarkable man had been living on millions in stolen money seemed impossible to reconcile with the person she thought she knew. The case also reopened wounds for those connected to the original investigation. Special Agent Robert Kowalski, who had led the FBI's inquiry in 1980 and 1981, was retired and living in Florida when he learned of Williams's arrest. In a telephone interview with the Dayton Daily News, Kowalski admitted feeling both vindicated and frustrated. He had been correct that the thief was someone with routine access to Building 262, but the investigation had never pushed hard enough on the civilian contractor employees. The assumption had been that a janitor lacked the sophistication to plan and execute such a theft. That assumption, Kowalski acknowledged, had been their fundamental error. Williams hadn't been sophisticated despite being a janitor. He had been successful because he was one. For Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, the resolution of the case brought mixed emotions. On one hand, solving a 27-year-old mystery provided closure and vindicated the institutional belief that the theft had been an inside job. On the other hand, it highlighted embarrassing security failures that had allowed a night shift custodian to study, plan, and execute a multi-million-dollar theft over the course of years. The base's public affairs office declined most interview requests, issuing only a brief statement acknowledging the arrest and noting that security procedures had been extensively modernized since 1980. The financial recovery proved disappointing. Federal prosecutors traced some of Williams's bank accounts and seized approximately $340,000 in addition to the cash found in the hidden room. But the majority of the $3.2 million remained unaccounted for. Williams had spent some over the years on living expenses, travel, and his modest lifestyle. Some had likely been withdrawn as cash and stored in locations he never disclosed. In his single interview from prison, Williams smiled when asked about the missing money, but said nothing, taking whatever secrets remained to his grave. The most poignant aspect of the case emerged from Williams's own confession, which investigators released excerpts from during the trial. In his writings, Williams described the theft not as a criminal masterstroke, but as an act of desperation by someone who had been invisible his entire life. He wrote about the humiliation of being 40 years old and barely able to afford car repairs, of watching officers half his age discuss weekend plans that cost more than his monthly rent, of understanding that he would work until he died and still never have enough. The theft, he wrote, was less about greed than about finally being able to breathe without the constant pressure of poverty crushing down on him. This confession complicated public perception of Williams. While he was undeniably a thief who had stolen millions from the military, his motivations resonated with working-class Americans who understood the grinding exhaustion of never having enough. Some saw him as a criminal who deserved his punishment. Others saw him as a symbol of economic inequality, someone who had been pushed to crime by a system that kept him invisible and poor despite steady work. The debate played out in newspaper editorial pages and local talk radio for months after his sentencing. The case also influenced popular culture in unexpected ways. Williams's story inspired a 2011 independent film loosely based on the theft, though the movie took substantial creative liberties. True crime podcasts revisited the case multiple times between 2015 and 2020, analyzing Williams's planning methods and debating whether his patient approach represented genius or simply luck. Security consultants used the case in training presentations, demonstrating how insider threats often come from overlooked personnel who have time to observe vulnerabilities. Perhaps most significantly, Williams's case contributed to broader conversations about bearer bonds and negotiable instruments in government operations. By the time of his arrest in 2007, bearer bonds had already been largely phased out due to concerns about money laundering and tax evasion. Williams's theft, finally solved after nearly 3 decades, provided a historical example of why such instruments were inherently dangerous. They were, as one Treasury Department official noted, money that belonged to whoever held it, designed for an era of trust that no longer existed. For Terrence Williams, the final years brought a kind of peace he had never known during his decades of hiding. In prison, he no longer had to maintain the exhausting pretense of being someone he wasn't. Other inmates knew his story, and some even respected the audacity of what he had accomplished. He spent his time reading, playing chess, and occasionally corresponding with journalists and authors interested in his case. When his health failed and he was transferred to the nursing facility, he accepted death with the same quiet patience that had defined his criminal career. He left behind no family to mourn him and no assets to distribute. His obituary in the Columbus Dispatch was brief, noting only his death and his conviction, a final reduction of a complex life to a single criminal act. But those who studied his case understood that Williams had been more than just a thief. He had been a man who turned invisibility into power, patience into profit, and poverty into a strange kind of freedom. His crime was perfect until it wasn't. Undone not by investigative brilliance, but by the mundane realities of aging, illness, and the simple human desire to move to a smaller home. The house in Kettering stands as the last physical reminder of his story, though nothing about it suggests the drama that unfolded within its walls. Families have lived there since. Children have played in the backyard where Williams once burned evidence, and the basement where he hid millions has been transformed into a bright family room with new carpet and fresh paint. The secret is gone, replaced by ordinary suburban life, as if Terrence Williams and his 27-year deception had never existed at all.